There was time, there's a wonderful quote from the French philosopher, poet, Paul Valéry, which is often misattributed to, I think, Casey Stengel, might be Yogi Berra, and that is that the future isn't what it used to be. And what they meant by that was not something funny, what Valéry meant by that, but the fact that for most of human history, the future was like today and yesterday. My children's life were going to be like mine, and mine was like my grandparents, right? Things did not change much. Occasionally, some catastrophe, like a war or a plague, came along and disrupted things, but there was no sense of progress. Generation after generation, life for most people on the planet was unchanging. And then beginning a little bit with the Renaissance, but taking off with the scientific and industrial revolutions, that all changed. That is, tomorrow was not like today and yesterday. The future was no longer what it used to be. It was novel. It was unpredictable. And it was especially unpredictable because of science. That is, that science invented new ideas that led to things that were unimaginable before. Science and technology created the foundation for fundamental uncertainty. And as the world grew increasingly connected, more complex, then systems became kind of complex and generated uncertainty as well. So we are now in a time of fundamental, irreducible uncertainty. And therefore, we require new ways of thinking about the future in the face of that uncertainty. And that's what scenario planning is about, and that's what I've done all my life. All of our kind of biological and cultural instincts are about continuity. They're not about discontinuity. And so it really requires serious thought to begin to explore how and why the world changes as it does and the different paths it might take into the future, and therefore what we should do today. Over the centuries, we've seen companies that actually have had a long view and had the courage of their convictions and have delivered great long-term returns to their shareholders. A good example of that was DuPont, right? DuPont is over 200 years old. It started out as an explosives company for the War of 1812. It's been a long time since it made dynamite. And it's been through many businesses and evolved many times over that. And each was based not on shareholder return, but on the evolution of the marketplace and of the nature of the technologies that they were working with. So they've evolved many times, but it took conviction to fight often the pressure of the marketplace and of the stock market. But if you delivered again and again and again, you basically could get away with it. And so I think one of the things that happened over a long run was that you got more and over the last, let me call it 30 years, more and more attention on short-term shareholder return. It was much more visible. It was the subject of constant discussion. It was on the news every day. And I think many, many CEOs felt that, and that outside investors in the market put such pressure on them that if they didn't, they'd be fired. But what has just begun to happen in, let's call it the last couple of years, and I think, frankly, Salesforce is one of the leaders on this, and Mark Benioff, is reconceiving of the role of business as stakeholders rather than shareholders, serving multiple stakeholders, customers, employees, society, the environment, the future, and shareholders. Not eliminating shareholders, but only one of a group of stakeholders. And you need to balance the interests of all. It's very straightforward. Having good rules in place, things like emission standards. Okay, it's a perfect example, right? Now, GM would probably not have produced cars with lower emissions at the pace that they did, or improved mileage at the pace that they did without the regulations. And now, what it allows is for GM, the CEO, to say to his or her board of directors, look, this is the regulation. And oh, by the way, everybody has to do it. right?
Mm.
So we are not uniquely singled out. I am not taking unique risk. If you have good regulation, well timed, then everybody responds, and that is, now I said a very important word: good regulation.
Mm.
You could have ineptly designed regulation,
Okay.
and that's an important issue. And look, and we've seen huge gains from that. I mean, the
Mm.
efficiency of car or clean air, right?
Okay.
The car of today is 99% cleaner than the car of my childhood. And
Mhm.
that's because of the Clean Air Act and the emission standards that went with it.
Mhm.
That would not have happened. And no one in the industry was wildly in favor of it. But
Mhm.
on the other hand, they wanted everybody to have the same regulation.
Yeah.
And that was critical. It creates distortions in the market. It permits, for example, the weak players to compete unfairly against the
Mm.
stronger players, right?
Mm. Mm.
Look, there's no doubt that some companies moved early to create the capacity to build, say, electric vehicles, right? So you eliminate either the incentives or the regulations requiring zero emissions, for example, for a certain part of the fleet, and it empowers those weaker players who can't achieve those standards, who can't build electric vehicles.
Yeah, I'm with you.
And on the other hand, so it gives a kind of competitive disadvantage to the innovator. What we have here is a kind of set of rules of competition.
Okay.
And so the question is, do you want rules that favor the weak competitors? And
Mm.
that's generally what the kind of lobbying efforts are about. The strong competitors do not have to undermine regulation.
Mhm.
The weak competitors do. It is so clear that the government spending rules that have permitted corporations to be treated as people have absolutely fundamentally undermined the democratic process.
Mm.
They've given them unique weight. And earlier I talked about stakeholders.
Mhm.
And corporations are one stakeholder among many.
Mhm.
Okay. There are other political institutions, but most of all, they're the citizens. And citizens may have different views that agree in some cases or disagree with others with respect to business. Though that's quite legitimate and an appropriate place for that to be expressed. But what is unique is the concentration of resources in the hands of business. It isn't that business shouldn't have a voice. It is but the scale of resources that they bring to it, which creates disproportionate power and disproportionate influence in that process. And as a result, the short-termers in business, which we talked about earlier, who have yet to take that long view, then have the ability to distort regulation in favor of the short run rather than the long run.
Mm.
And so if you're a company that can't meet the emission standards or can't meet the water quality standards, then you will compete to prevent those from being toughened. You will lobby and use your power in ways that ultimately defeat the interests of stakeholders and the future. The ones who see a better future for their companies, who actually have that long view, unquestionably, I think, will support taking the big money out of politics, taking the unique power of big business to influence power. I think they see the quality of democracy being undermined by that, the disincentive to participate, the cynicism that it puts in the minds of the public, the anti-business view that it begins to develop, that there's a war between the interests of business and the citizen. And I don't think there is. But I think that unique position of power creates that perception. So I think it is very much in the interest of far-sighted businesses who do take the long view to see an end to the kind of funding model that we now use for campaigns, and therefore would support a constitutional amendment, which I do, to eliminate that kind of funding.